Good evening. How's everybody doing? Just leave a message in the chat section. Just let me know that you're hearing me okay. Hopefully everyone's had a good day. Nice, casual, relaxing Wednesday evening. Thanks to those of you who have joined. Now, as mentioned in the post earlier on, tonight we're going to be looking at the next piece, I guess, in the puzzle of learning to read music. And of course, the best way to start with that is to perhaps have a little bit of a quick recap on what we went through last week. Hey Tim, how you going? So I've brought the PowerPoint back up onto the screen again, and I'll just get my screens ready. Here we go. All right. So as you know, last week we learnt a lot in a considerably short space of time. We went through the basic visuals of what a piece of music would look like, and we actually got all the way up to the point where we could recognise at least one different type of note and how that note could be positioned within our music to tell us information about what kind of instrument or what part of the drum set we're going to be playing. Now, again, I'm going to have a quick recap just to make sure that we're all still on the same page with that. But here we go. And just in case anyone's wondering, that's the legendary Gavin Harrison there on the cover. Fantastic player. If you haven't heard him, definitely check him out with his band Porcupine Tree. Fantastic stuff. So one thing I want to stress before we get going is that you need to have some knowledge of what we went through last week. So you need to understand, first of all, how the reading how the reading and writing of music is going to be beneficial to you as a player. This is important because, as I covered last week, if you don't understand why you're learning it, then when things get difficult, you just put it back on the shelf, right? Hopefully you understood from what I'd said last week and from things that I showed last week that there is a value to doing this, not least of all being able to record the types of ideas that you're thinking in your head without having the need to get a physical recorder or a camera. You can actually just quickly jot things down. So that's one way. You could also then pick up a book and you can play things that you've never seen nor heard before. And when you talk about a lot of kids these days, they're all learning from YouTube and stuff, which is great. But of course, you can't really discover anything new until you go onto YouTube and start searching through that stuff. Whereas you could pick up a book straight away, open it, read the notes, and bang, there's a whole wealth of information right in front of you. So in the same way that learning to read words in a book has taught us a lot about, everything, music is the same way. When we learn to read and write music, it opens up this whole realm of possibilities for learning. Now, we need to also understand the concept of a measure, or sometimes called a bar. And this was the space that we had. If you're thinking about the Lego that we had last week, we had these little grey pieces that we could put Lego blocks on. And those pieces, when we talked about music, that translated across to being a period of time. It was 4 counts, and you could put your notes inside this bracket of music. But then once that measure or that bar was full, then you had to close it off and then start a new one. And as I said last week, those measures were kind of how we look at sentences when we talk about writing words, okay? So we have these little sections called sentences, which helps to break up our words and to make things easier to read and to follow along with. Measures do exactly the same thing. They break music into smaller, bite-sized pieces. And of course, the way we break them up is by using things called bar lines, okay? It's a vertical line that goes through those 5 lines that we called the staff, and that's kind of our full stop when it comes to music. Right, we have 4 counts, we close that bar with a bar line, and we begin a new bar. And we can keep going on indefinitely. You need to name the parts of a quarter note. So they are the note head, so that's the little black spot on the note, and that will sit somewhere inside those 5 lines, or above those 5 lines, or below those 5 lines, and that will tell you what instrument is being played, depending on where it's sitting. There's also the stem of the note. Now, that's the vertical line that either sits to the right-hand side of the note head and points up, or it sits to the left-hand side of the note head and points down. And depending on whether it points up or down, it's obviously just all about efficiency. But normally, if the note head sits above that middle line of those 5 horizontal lines, then we'll point the stems down and to the left. If that note head sits below that middle of the 5 lines, then the stem will sit to the right of the note and point upwards. Okay, so this was all covered in the last exercise, so feel free to go back and have a look at that if you need to. The next step is we have to understand the different ways that a quarter note can be written and connected. Okay, now we don't actually connect quarter notes because we have a note head and a staff, and they kind of sit in their own little space, and we can have 4 of them in a measure, and then once that measure contains either 4 quarter notes, either as notes that we play or as notes that we call rests, which we count but don't play. But once we've got 4 of those things, then it's full, and we close that measure and we move on. Okay? And lastly, we need to be able to write all of the parts of our drum kit on the staff as quarter notes. Now, this is a little bit tricky because if you have a lot of drums and a lot of cymbals on your drum kit and you wanted to denote each of them differently, then obviously you're going to be using more notes or more positions in that staff than somebody who's only playing a basic sort of 4-piece drum kit with a hi-hat, crash and ride. But we went through the main ones. So we went through the kick, the snare, at least 2 of the toms. We went through the hi-hat, the ride and the crash, and we saw where they're all positioned and how they all look when they're placed on that staff. And we'll see that slide again shortly anyway. Okay, now we also discussed, but we didn't show, and I'm actually going to show this now. Last week we looked at how quarter notes appear on a page. So every measure, so that's every one of these sort of little vertical bar lines. There's our bar lines, and in between each bar line is a bar or a measure. And we've got 4 notes or 4 positions that we can do what we want with within that measure. Okay, so you can see in the first example or in the first measure, we have that position is a snare drum, so it sits between the second and third line from the top. So that note head is always in the same spot for every one of these notes. So this exercise is going to be all played on the snare. But you can see that some of these stems go up and some of these stems go down. Now, technically, I wouldn't write them all like this because it's a little bit confusing, but that's actually intentional. It's meant to be an exercise to try and challenge you and throw you off. In reality, what I would probably do is I would face all of the stems down because, as I just discussed, the note head is sitting above the middle staff line. So to keep things sort of all efficient and sort of working in against each other and nice and compact, we would point those stems down. But what we can see in the first measure here is that every count on the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4 contains a snare drum. But once we get into the second measure, we can see that some of these notes, or some of these counts rather, will be rests. So in the second measure, you can see here that although I'm playing a snare drum on 1, there's a rest on 2, I'm playing a snare drum on 3, and I'm playing a snare drum on 4. And I read through this until I get to the very end. Now, one thing we didn't see last week is that there's a double line at the end here, which basically just means that that's the end of the piece of music. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play through the first 2 lines and show you what that actually sounds like, and I'll change the camera to do it. In fact, no, I won't, because you'll need to read along with me. But you can also see that we have this tempo marking, and we briefly discussed the tempo marking last week. And what that means is it's telling you that the quarter notes are meant to be counted at 120 clicks or 120 beats per minute. So that's 2 every second. And if you have a metronome, which any drummer worth his salt should have, then you would simply dial in the 120. And I'm going to do this on my little Roland module here. And when you click start, you'll start hearing these counts. Now, the high-pitched count that you hear is meant to be telling you where 1 is. So that's the beginning of each measure. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to turn around now and I'm going to play on my snare drum. So the idea, of course, if you go to any lesson and you're learning this stuff, they always say to you, you need to count along while you play. Okay? So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Second line. 1, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 4. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Last line. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you see that the rests, I mean, this is not particularly difficult to play, but remember that what we're trying to do here is we're learning to read music and play along while we read. So it's a new skill for those people that haven't done it. And maybe you wouldn't go as fast as 120 because you actually have to read a little bit ahead of where you are, and that's it's quite challenging if you haven't done that before because you're reading, you're playing. We're lucky this is all on the snare drum because if it was moved around to different parts of the kit, it would be another level of challenge again. But that's pretty much how we use the metronome. The metronome counts off the quarter notes, and we're either playing or we're not playing on the counts that the metronome is giving us. Now, one very, very important thing, you would have heard this if you've ever had a lesson yourself, you must count along when you play. And the reason you do that is it's forcing you to think while you play, but it's also reinforcing where 1 is. 1 is an incredibly important point in any measure because it's normally where it signals the change in music, going from, say, a verse or a chorus or a verse to a pre-chorus. So even if you're not counting every single note, you have to be very acutely aware of where the 1 is. Very, very important. Okay, and how we reinforce that, of course, is by going through these exercises very much like this, but learning to count as we play. Remember, this is not going to it's not going to be developing your ability as a player initially. We're trying to learn to read. This is a mental thing. This is learning to tie a new idea together with what we can already play. So if you're looking at this piece of music and going, yeah, but I can play much better than this. Yes, but that's not the point, right? We're trying to bring our reading up to a point where it's going to be useful for us for the level that we're at as a player, okay? It's going to take some time. Okay, and as promised, this is where the note heads would sit relative to all the different parts on a standard 5-piece kit. Now notice obviously that cymbals are denoted as X's, and the drums themselves, whether it be kick drum, snare or tom, is usually denoted as a solid round circle that either sits between or going through any of those 5 lines. You can also see the crash cymbal actually sits above the staff. So we've got the 5 lines, but then the cymbal itself sits through an imaginary, it's almost like a 6th line. We don't draw the whole line, we only draw a little piece of it, but that's why that little X there actually looks as though it's more of a star. So it's an X, but it has a horizontal line through it, just a piece of the line to give you reference of how far it's sitting above those 5 lines, okay? Hopefully that's all clear at this point. So now we're going to move on to what we call eighth notes. Now, you can probably already ascertain what these are going to be about, but let's break them down. When we started last week, we talked about Lego, and Lego's fantastic because everybody knows how to use Lego and everybody knows how to play with Lego. And we introduced this concept whereby we had this grey base piece, and this grey base piece can fit a certain number of blocks, right? And it doesn't take a genius to figure out now in week 2 that grey piece is meant to indicate our measure or our bar. Okay, but we could fit 4 of these blocks, either a yellow block where we were playing a note, or a clear block where we chose to not play a note but still count it, right? The rests, in other words. And we could put any combination of those 2 bricks together until we had 4 bricks on the grey piece. The grey piece would then be full, and then we'd need to start a new grey piece. All right, so that's hopefully fairly simple in concept. And what we do now is we introduce a new type of block. And what's happening here is now we have green blocks and again more clear blocks. But these are exactly half the size of the blocks that we were using last week. Or to look at it another way, we could use 8 of these blocks in the same space that we could have used 4 blocks last week. So this is giving us more choices, more things that we can do or choose not to do on our grey base piece as we put those blocks together. Okay. Now here we go. So this is one of those little blocks in the measure. The 2 new bricks that we use, of course, as I said, you can fit 8 of them in a bar, but it's on a grey base piece rather. But it's still all about this concept of filling the space that we have, either with notes that we play, or green blocks or yellow blocks, or notes that we're choosing to count but not play. So that's the clear box. Okay. So here's just a few examples of ways that we could actually put this together. So in the first grey base piece, we've got 2 green blocks, so 2 blocks where we're actually hitting something, and then we leave a space, and then we hit another block, and then we leave 2 spaces, and so we're just sort of filling in with sort of different coloured blocks, all of the same size. But the takeaway point from this is that we have 8 blocks in each grey piece now, not 4, and each of those little blocks that we use are half the size of the blocks that we were dealing with last week. In other words, you could fit twice as many of them, 8 in fact, into the same space that we could have fit 4 of them last week. Okay? Feel free to ask questions if it's not clear, if you want to know anything more about that, and I'll address them as we go along. All right, so there's our blocks that we used last week. You can see how they're twice the size of the blocks that we're looking at this week. Okay? Now, the reason they're called eighth notes is because when we start reflecting this back and sort of transposing it for what this would mean in music, it means that each one of these notes that we use, each one of these new blocks, is going to be 1/8 of that full measure. Or in other words, we can have 8 of them put together before that measure becomes full. And this is what they will look like. Now, when we apply the concept to our musical notation, as I said, we can fit 8 of them, but we need to understand that we still have this 1, 2, 3, 4 count, okay? This metronome count, that's always going to be there. So it's not just about knowing that we have to fit 8 of them in the bar. There's obviously going to be some of these notes that are going to hit in time with where our quarter notes were last week, but there's going to be some new notes that are going to be elsewhere in that bar that are not having a count going along with them. We have to sort of figure out where they're going to sit relative to where that count is. It's a little bit challenging to grasp this concept, but when I play it, it becomes instantly obvious, okay? So what we do is we have notes that we'll be playing on the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the same as they were last week for quarter notes. But now we introduce this new note that sits exactly halfway between those counts on 1, 2, 3, 4. And what we do is we call them and. Sometimes you'll see them written just as an add symbol or a plus symbol, which is obviously easier than writing the word and. But that's the way they're counted. Now, I'm going to actually dial this metronome back a little bit because I want to be able to obviously do this without having to wrap up to speed. But if this was my quarter note, what that quarter note tells me is where the 1, 2, and the 3, 4 lay. Okay, so it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. This is the red triangles that you're seeing in front of you now. Now, as you can see, we have to actually have a note that sits in between, but not just in between, exactly halfway between where we're hearing those counts. And one way that I get my students to do this is to start off playing the quarter notes. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I'm counting quarter notes. 3, 4, and I'm playing quarter notes, right? And then what I would do is I would put all of that just on my right hand. 2. Now notice that my right hand has to play in time with every metronome count. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it becomes a case of adding my left hand in between without changing the speed of my right hand. One, 2, 3, 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So you can see that the right hand is constantly falling on that count, on that metronome count. Okay? So you're probably thinking, yeah, well, so what? Right? Well, if we look at the next example, and in fact, I'll just quickly show you what an eighth note actually looks like once you add all the other elements to it. So it looks very similar to a quarter note, by the way. The only difference is, apart from the note head and the stem, we now have this extra little tail, which by definition is known as a flag. And this flag just kind of hangs down as you see it, okay? Now, if the note was upside down, then what would happen is the stem would be on the other side, and the note head actually goes the same way. It always goes to the right-hand side of the note. All right, but it's going to get a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially this is what your eighth note is going to look like. Okay, now in addition, let's just go back, we can have eighth note rests. So these are spots in the bar where we choose not to play anything, but we still have to count it. And this just looks like a little bit of a 7, and that never changes direction. When you see an eighth note rest inside a measure somewhere, it'll always look like this, and it will always be this way up. So that's a pretty easy one to remember. All right. So as I said, we have the note head with a little flag, okay? And that's what really makes an eighth note an eighth note. When you see that one flag, that one sort of ribbon or piece of rope hanging off the top of that stem, you'll know that that's an eighth note, okay? Now, as I said before, the note can also, much like a quarter note, you can have the stem of that note pointing down, but notice how the flag still hangs on the right-hand side of the stem. It's always to the right-hand side of the stem, okay? So just get yourself familiar with how both of those look. And as I pointed out, the flag can move in two directions. Okay. Now, the thing that makes eighth notes different, or one of the things that makes eighth notes different from quarter notes, is that if we have a bunch of eighth notes together, we can actually take that flag and join them all across the line. So think of it as like a piece of ribbon. If this note can find other notes that also have one piece of ribbon, well, you can tie them together. And you can tie them together either in groups of 2 or in groups of 4. All right. Now, this is, again, it's one of those things you just choose to do. In fact, if they were all eighth notes in that measure, you could actually join all of them, but then you're joining 8 of them together. The problem with doing that is it starts to become difficult to sort of see how many eighth notes you're actually dealing with. So in practice, when we actually see music written out with eighth notes, we usually see them joined either in groups of 4, so that's, if you can see them here on the bottom section, I tend to join them in groups of 2, and the reason I do that is it makes it very clear where the quarter note is, where the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4 are. So I sort of tend to group them within each main count, but then sort of break them apart so that there's no more than, say, 2 at a time. That makes it very easy to sort of keep track of them and keep track of where you are in the measure. Now, when it comes to joining these flags, and this is where we take a little bit of a leap here, if we have 2 of them together, as I said, we can join the flag. So on that second note, so this note here, even though when it's in isolation, you just see the flag hanging down to the right, when it has another 8th note to join to, we can actually swing that flag back the other way and join them together. All right, so what we see on the right-hand side there is technically how you would see 2 8th notes if they were written one next to each other. Again, you don't have to, but it's more correct to write them that way, and you always take advantage to make things look as clean and as simple as possible. Now, if the 8th note was sitting to the left-hand side of our first 8th note, that doesn't matter. You can still join them again in exactly the same way because they're both 8th notes, okay? So you join each single flag together and you're good to go. And of course, if you have 4 of these things sitting on their own, hey, join them all together. Now, notice here, in this the second and third note along this second and third 8th note, we actually see the flag is sort of, it's tapering off to the right, but it also tapers off to the left to join the notes either side of it. And this is where where I sort of make a little bit of a departure, because I've just said to you, that the flags always hang to the right. Well, they do, but that's only when they're on their own. Again, what defines an 8th note when you're looking at it on paper is that there is one line crossing through that stem, and that line can either cross through it to the left-hand side, which is what you're seeing on this note here. You can see that the flag actually goes back towards the first 8th note, or the flag could actually move to the right, like you're seeing in this second example here. The first note, the flag moves out to the right. Or, as you can see in this example, the flag actually moves both ways, but the point is there's just one flag, there's one single line cutting through that stem. If there was no flag touching that stem, then it would be a quarter note. Okay, I'll repeat that. If there is no flag touching the stem of a note, then that note is a quarter note. Can't be an 8th note, because an 8th note has to have a flag joined to it at the stem. Okay? And if it has more than one flag joined to it, well, we'll get to that later. Now, of course, as I said, if you have a whole run of 8th notes like we do here, you could technically join them all together, but it looks too messy. It's too grouped together. You can't see instantly how many notes there are to play in front of you. So we tend to join those things by groups of 2 or 4. Okay, hopefully this is making sense so far. Again, feel free to ask questions if you need to. Now look at this last example. And this is what we're going to get onto now, which is actually working back and forth between the 2 types of note that we've learnt so far. So when you have 8th notes next to 8th notes, well, you can join the flag. We've just covered that. But when there's a quarter note stuck in there somewhere, we can't do that. And the reason we can't do that is because once you join a flag over the stem of a quarter note, it's not a quarter note anymore. By definition, any stem that has a flag attached to it is an 8th note. So once we get to this third note here, which is clearly a quarter note, we can't join any further. It has to sit on its own. So the first and the second 8th note, yep, no problem. I can join my flag back this way. Sorry, let me do it on the screen here. So when it comes to this first and second note, I can join the flag from this second note back to the first one because they're both 8th notes. But the flag on this second note cannot go across and touch the third note because the third note is a quarter note. Okay, and again, the next 2 notes, yeah, we can join them, no problem at all, but then we hit another quarter note. So nothing can touch the stem of this note either. And so this is actually what we end up seeing. 2 8th notes joined together, the quarter note which has to sit on its own, 2 more 8th notes joined together, and then a quarter note that sits on its own. So this is just basic theory about how these 8th notes can be flagged, which direction the flags can travel, what they can pass through, what they can't pass through. All right, now, if I was giving a lesson to a student, I'd actually pull out a bunch of exercises now just to reinforce that concept. But again, you can go through this and revisit it at any time. Now, what is of absolute prime importance is that we understand the relationship between quarter notes and 8th notes. We know how quarter notes look, we know how 8th notes look, and we know how they have to be counted. Quarter notes are always counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and we know that 8th notes can be counted 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. but they are related to one another, and we have to be very, very clear about how they're related. Now, I went through the example earlier, but essentially, if we're counting quarter notes and we hear this 1, 2, 3, 4, we know that with the example of quarter notes, we're going to play on each one of those hits. Quarter notes will not play on the and because that's an eighth note thing, right? We've learnt last week that quarter notes can either be counted or played on the 1, the 2, the 3, or the 4. That's it. Okay? So the moment you start putting notes on ands, which is what we're seeing on the bottom line here, then we start talking about eighth notes. However, they both share some similarities, and one of the similarities is both of them will always be played on a quarter note. It's just all about what's happening in between. So with our count now back at 80 beats a minute, our quarter note count, we would be counting 1, 2, 3, 4. Quarter notes would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Eighth notes would sound like this. 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Right? So it's not just that eighth notes are faster, they are exactly twice as fast, or, another way of putting it, they take up exactly half the amount of space that a quarter note does. So a really good exercise to practice is to be playing back and forth between quarter notes and eighth notes and upping the speed. You'll be surprised that people think, oh yeah, I'm just doubling and halving. But without a metronome, most people don't double and half accurately. They actually go back to the halves a little slower or a little quicker. So this is still a very relevant exercise for everybody to play at any level. So I'm going to bump up the speed to about 120, and I'm just going to go through a few bars of changing back and forth between quarter notes and eighth notes. I will only be counting the quarter notes though. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll just move the snare back so you can see it. Okay, so I'm going to go a bit quicker. So now we're going to go up to 170 beats a minute. So this is quarter notes being counted at 170 beats per minute. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. All right. So again, simple in terms of a concept, but now we're reading along. Now we understand what it is that we're seeing, and of course, that's a great thing because now we're learning something that we didn't know before. Now, when it comes to rhythm, of course, rhythms are often a little bit more complex than just doubling and halving. And one way I teach my students is to actually clap out a rhythm and then to try and figure out what that would look like if it was written down as a piece of music. So going back to 80 beats a minute now, I have a method now that I can count. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, this I know. It's all great. And now on certain notes, or on certain eighth notes, I'm going to be clapping. So if we look at that first line there, I'm just going to clap where that count falls. So here's eighth notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and I'm just going to clap where those counts, where you see the hands on that count. So it's 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3 and 4. 1, 2, 3 and 4. Okay? So fairly simple rhythm, but what would it look like written down on paper? Well, we know that, and think back to your Lego blocks example. This is what makes this all gel together. We have a hand clap on 1. Now, the biggest note that we could actually put in there would be a quarter note, and we know from last week that if we used a quarter note there, that would take up all the space until we get to 2. Now, however, there's nothing happening on 2. We still have to fill in more space, but we don't have a hit there. So how do we fill that space? Well, we put a rest in. We put a quarter note rest, and that will cater to all the way up to the count of 3. Okay? And then on 3, we have a clap on 3, but we need to have a clap on and. So there's no point putting a quarter note on 3 because that's going to take up all the space till 4. We need that space in between because we have to have another hand clap there. Okay, does that make sense? So we have a quarter note on 1, then we continue that by having a rest to fill up all that space between 2 and 3. Then we have an eighth note on 3, which will take up all of the room until 3 and. Then on 3 and, we have another eighth note, which will take up that space between and until we get to 4. And then on 4, we have a quarter note because we've got this and space left that we're not putting anything on. So we may as well just have a block that takes up not only the space between 4 and 4 and, but also the space between that and what would be the next measure starting. Okay, so we use a big block rest, two small blocks, and then one large block at the end. So if you were to do that on your grey bass piece, you would know that that would now be full. And if you were to translate that back to notes, what we would see is a quarter note on 1, a rest on 2, and then 3 and our eighth notes, and then 4 as a quarter note. Let's look at another one. So the second line down is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, so again, moving along from the first clap, we need to have a clap on and, so we can't use a large block. So that first note is going to have to be an eighth note. That note will take up all of the room until we get to and then on and we've got another hand clap or another eighth note. Okay, so that's now going to take up all the way until the count of 2. Now, 2 doesn't have anything on the and, so what we can do is just grab a large block from our toolkit and fill all that space all the way from 2 up to 3. So that's going to be a quarter note there. And then when we get to 3, it's the same approach again. We don't have anything on the and, so we can just use a quarter note to take up all that space until we get to 4. Now, both 4 and 4 and have to have notes played on them, so each note has to be that half size, that eighth note block again. So it's eighth note, quarter note again, eighth note, eighth note. So on the right-hand side, you can see how that looks. 1 and 2, 3, 4, and. Okay? We're going to go through one more. So the third line now. We have a hand clap on 1. We don't have anything on and, so again, we can use a large piece here. So this is a quarter note. So we use the quarter note on 1. Then both 2 and are small notes. Now, one thing you might be saying is, well, if there's a space here, couldn't we make this note on and a large block and make it fill up that whole space? The answer is actually we can, but it gets into a slightly different scenario. And one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to start joining notes over the quarter notes. We talked about joining eighth notes before, and as I said, I tend to join them in 2s. Now, with quarter notes, we know that quarter notes generally play on the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4. But now we're in a spot where this note is being played on the and. Now, it needs to take up as much room as a quarter note, but it's not really in the right place for a quarter note because it's on an and. So what I would choose to do there is still use an eighth note, because if you use a quarter note, someone who's reading the music might think, oh, that must be where the 1, 2, 3, or 4 is. And of course, that's not the case in this example. So I would write quarter note on 1, eighth note, another eighth note. Now, this eighth note, of course, is only going to take us up to 3. So what do we do on 3? Well, we do the same as we would always do for any count where we're counting but not playing. We would just use a rest. And we need that rest to cover all of the place between 3 right up to the point that we get to 3 and. So that's an eighth note rest in there. Hopefully that makes sense. And then the and note, of course, has to be a small one again, so there's another eighth note there. But then 4 needs to take up that whole space until the end of the measure. So it needs to take up the 4 and also the and, so we can have a quarter note there. Again, when I give lessons, I give a whole bunch of these examples so you can really reinforce this concept. But it somewhat explains over on the right-hand side why you're seeing the things you are. See that second one off the bottom here? We've got all of these little rests and eighth notes. We try not to use rests if we can avoid it, because rests can look a little bit messy, but we don't have much of a choice here because all of these large gaps that we see, we'd love to put quarter notes, but none of those notes are sitting on 1, 2, 3, or 4. So we've got really not much choice but to put rests and then a note after it to take up that space. So it's not ideal, but again, it's all about ease of reading. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, so when we talk about the way that these things look on paper, because we can join the flags, and this is something new that we've only seen with eighth notes, it now becomes a question of, well, what happens if we start joining flags, but like some of the stems are up and some of the stems are down? Isn't that going to look kind of weird? And the answer is yes, it is. And so normally what you do, like you can see on the second line here, if you have note heads that are sitting both above and also below that middle staff line, the stems can go either way, but you would you would write them in a direction that allows you to join two of them in the same direction. So, for example, this second count here of 2 and 2 and, now this note on 2, this note head, that sits below the middle staff line. So if it was just sitting by its own, we'd probably point the stem upwards. However, we have this note that it's joining to, so these are both eighth notes, but this one's sitting well above the middle staff line, so that should have a stem pointing down in an ideal situation. So you make a bit of a conscience call and you say, well, I could either join the stem up or down, but they have to both be going the same way if I'm going to join them, right? And so in the first example, I've opted to join them with the stems up. In the second example, I'm joining them with the stems facing down. My choice, but make it easy to read, okay? You can see, as I said before, that rests never turn up the other way. They're always the same way up, okay, as just a basic 7 sitting right through the middle of that staff. And like we saw last week, if we have some notes that are being played together at the same time, like we can see here, a snare drum and a bass drum, if we're playing them together, then the same as it would be with quarter notes, we put those note heads one on top of each other, but all of the other rules for eighth notes now apply. So we can still join notes that are the same. So on the second last line here, you can see on the counts of 4 and 4 and, 4 is only a snare, 4 and actually has a snare and a bass drum, but they're both eighth notes. So we can actually still join them, and that's the way they will look. We still have that single flag, okay? Now this on 3 and is actually also an eighth note. So if I wanted to, I could join that flag and put 3 of them together. And in some cases you do see that. But as I mentioned before, I tend to like joining these things in 2s. And so what you can see, hopefully, is that this first block of 2 is 1 and 1 and. This next block of 2 is 2 and 2 and. The third block is a rest and 3 and the last block is 4 and 4 and. So I'm trying to break up each quarter note and sort of group them, you know, together in their own little sections, so it's fairly easy to see where the different counts are. And it gets easier with experience, but that's kind of why I'm doing it. Okay, and I'll just shoot through this because I've explained it all. All right. So this is interesting. So now we can substitute rests, and we saw this a little bit beforehand, but keep an eye out for this little star. So when we get to it, I'm going to explain how everything I've just said can, on occasion, be a little bit different. So when we look at these notes, what we're trying to do is we're trying to remove rests as much as possible. In this first measure here, you can see that, and I've put my count above the measure here so you can follow along. We have a hit on 1, we have a hit on and, we have a hit on 2, then there's a rest on 2 and, then we play on 3, we play on and, we play on 4, and then there's a rest on the 4 and. Now, as we saw with that Lego bricks example, or that clapping exercise that I brought up on the screen earlier, if we're not playing a note on the and, well, what we can actually do is just make this note bigger to cater for that extra space where we've got the and, okay? And that's exactly what we've done. So when we look on the right-hand side here, we've actually taken away the eighth note and the rest and just substituted that for a full quarter note. Because if you think about how this sounds, on the left-hand side here, we're going to have 1 and 2 rest, 3 and 4 rest. It's basically the jingle bells rhythm, right? It's jingle bells, jingle bells. All right? There's no need to have a rest on the and of 2 and on the and of 4, because if we use a quarter note on 2 and a quarter note on 4, well, you can't play ands there anyway. There's no room for it because you've used the block to take up that entire space between 2 and 3 and between 4 and the next measure. All right? Feel free to send me a comment to make sure you're all getting this, or if I'm just talking a whole bunch of white noise to you. Okay? So in the second example, we've got 1, a rest on and, 2, a rest on and, 3, a rest on and 4, a rest on and. So there's no ands at all. So obviously you could just use quarter notes on all of that and get rid of the need for placing rests there altogether. Okay? It's a little bit like, I don't know how good you guys are at maths, but it's a bit like factorization, where you try and take the largest block that you can use to say what it is that you want to say without having to leave pieces out or put extra bits of ink on the paper. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, there's no point writing spaces on and when we have blocks that will get rid of all of those ands anyway. All right? The only time we have to use those smaller blocks is when we start playing things on the and, okay? Third example, we've got nothing on 1. We can't do much about that. We're going to have a rest there. We have and being played, nothing on 2, and on there's a note on 2 and, there's a note on 3, nothing on 3 and, a note on 4, and nothing on 4 and. Now, I'm going to skip this, the notation of this, and I'm going to quickly go through the last one. So the last one, A note on 1 and then nothing. So we can use a quarter note there. Get rid of that rest. A note on 2 and then a rest. Get rid of that note. Use a quarter note. Okay. Now notice we're using kick and snare here, but it doesn't matter. The theory is the same. And then 3 and, well, they are eighth notes, so they'll stay as they are. And then 4 is a note with a rest on and. So we can get rid of that as well and just use a quarter note. Okay, so hopefully you can see this simplification or this substitution of rests wherever we can. Now, this exercise here, the second one off the bottom, this is where we get to the little bit of a star. Now, you may have heard of a term called syncopation. And when you think of syncopation, if you're anything like me, you think of that book by Ted Reed that came out, decades and decades ago, the Blue Book, that has all of these kinds of notes in it, and you've got a bass drum going along on the count of 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're learning to play off the beat. And what that means is, for what we've learned, off the beat means we're not playing anything on 1, 2, 3, 4, but we're actually playing on those ands. Okay, they sometimes call this an upbeat as well, or an offbeat. Now, when we write our music, as I just said to you, I tend to group things in twos to make it easy to see where the quarter note would fall. And I don't ever write quarter notes on those ands because that's the space where we would normally use eighth notes. Now, I'm also here to tell you that that isn't always the case. There is another theory or another method of writing called syncopated rhythm, where it's all about filling the blocks on our grey piece of Lego, no matter where they fall. Okay, now we have two different blocks that we can use. We can use the larger quarter note size block, which we know takes up 1/4 or 1/4 of the grey bass piece. And we now have these eighth note blocks, which take up exactly half of that, or 1/8 of those of that grey piece. So what you do in syncopation is you basically look at where those notes are being hit, and you use whatever block you want, no matter where it is in the bar, to help say what it is that you want to say. And what I'm actually talking about here is this spot here, where we're looking at this quarter note. Now, what we've decided to do here, and we've written this in a syncopated manner, what this means is we have the rest on 1, and then we have a note on and nothing on 2. So what we would normally do there is we would leave it just as it is. We'd put the eighth note on and then we'd leave a rest on 2, because I wouldn't put a quarter note there, right? Because that's not a count of 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not where quarter notes normally go. But it can be written that way. And when we write it that way, what we're saying is, well, we don't really care where the hit falls in the bar. If it's taking up 2 eighth notes, hey, that's going to be a quarter note's worth of room. So I'm going to put a quarter note there. So if you were counting the right-hand bar, what you would actually count is 1. You would know that that type of rest is an eighth note, which means the very next count, if we're counting an eighth note, the very next count would be 1 and. But then we see a quarter note. And what the quarter note says to us is we need to play on that 1 end because there's a note there, but we won't be playing on 2 because a quarter note takes up 2 eighth notes worth of room. So when we see a quarter note there, we've actually now blocked out all of that space until we get to 2 and. Does that make sense? And then on 2 and, we've got an eighth note. And because that's an eighth note, the very next spot we will have to play will be on 3. 3 is a quarter note, which means it will take up that 2 notes worth of space. And so the very next spot we will have to play anything will be on 4. So reading this in a syncopated manner would actually sound like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Again, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So the quarter note and eighth note doesn't become necessarily about the 1, 2, 3, 4 or the and, but it talks very much about the amount of length that you give each note, right? It does make it harder to read because now you have to look at each note and know how long each note has to be held for before you play the next note. And this is where music can get challenging because, of course, we don't like using rests if we can help it. We'd rather use a note to take up that space where the rest would be and to not have to write that rest at all. Okay, well, you're going to see this in various forms as we go along, but just beware that this is a syncopated rhythm right here because we're choosing to use quarter notes in places in the measure that you wouldn't normally put a quarter note, in other words, on any of the ands. Okay? All right, now let's talk about the basic rock beat. Most people know how to play a basic rock beat with a kick and snare and kick and snare and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and you're playing all your hi-hats along with it. So let's have a look at what that would actually look like if we'd written it down. Now, we know a few things. We know that eighth notes, we can fit 8 of them in a bar. We know that eighth notes can join to one another if we've got eighth notes around them. We know that notes that are being played at the same time can be written one on top of each other, and we can choose which way we want the stems to face. So I'm going to show you what the standard rock beat looks like now, and I'm also showing you where the count falls relative to how this reads. Okay, so what you can see, hopefully, with everything that we've learned so far, and this is what it's leading to, is that on the count of 1 and 3, we have a bass drum, and obviously a hi-hat playing at the same time, because the hi-hats will play all the way through. On the counts of 2 and 4, we have snare drums, okay, which also join with hi-hats. But then we have these hi-hats playing in between each of those notes. Now, if you were to look at this on a sheet of paper and you don't know anything about reading music, you might even still be able to figure out what it is that they're asking you to play. But with what we've learned in the last 2 weeks, we know now that this is hi-hats, it's snare drums, it's bass drums, and they're played in very specific positions, but we also know how to count along with each of those beats. And this is very important for the next slide that we're about to see. So if I was to throw my metronome on at 80 beats a minute, okay, this is where the red markers are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So the bass drum would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And the snare drums would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The hi-hats would be 2 for every count. So it would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and put it all together, this is what you get. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and bass and snare and kick and snare and kick and snare and kick and snare and. All right? Now, hopefully everybody knows how to play a rock beat, but the important thing to take from this is now we know how it looks on paper, now we know how it's counted, and now we know how to play it at any tempo. So if I was to crank this tempo now to 120, we know that that's the quarter note, right? It's counting quarter notes at 120 beats a minute. We know that the quarter notes are where our bass drum and our snare drum fall. So it would be at this speed. Kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, snare, kicks, hi-hats over the top. Kick and snare and kick and snare and kick and snare and kick and snare and. Right, why is this important? Well, this is what we do when we count off a song, right? If someone says, oh, you know, Stewie, count us in. And it's like, yep, no worries. 1, 2, 3, 4, kick and snare and kick and snare. And so when you count off a song, you might instinctively just go straight into the beat, but now you understand what it is that you're actually doing. You're counting off quarter notes to give everybody a reference to how fast your beat is going to be, or where things are going to be, and the tempo that they're going to move. Okay? So with that, what you can then do is you can start picking up a book, and provided these beats are quarter notes and eighth notes, you should be able to play everything that you see. So this first exercise, for example, let's have a quick look at it. So we've got, in fact, let's not do the first one because we just did the first one, but the second one. So we see that we've got a bass drum on 1, we have a snare drum on 2, a bass drum on 3, and also a bass drum on 3 and. Okay, still 2 and 4 on the snare. So all that's going to have to happen now is that the kick drums, well, there's an extra one in there, and it's on 3 and. No problem. Let's count. 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. I'm going to tap out with my sticks where the bass drums are going to be. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 1 and 2. Okay, so you can figure out it's going to be kick and snare and kick, kick, snare. It's a simple beat, but once again, we know how this now looks on paper and how to play it along with a metronome. All right, skipping a couple now, we get to, let's take this exercise down here. Okay, so we have a kick drum on 1, we have a snare drum on 2, then we have kick drums on 2 and, 3, 3 and then a snare on 4. So this would be kick, snare, kick, 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 snare, or 1, 2 and 3 and 4. Hi-hats over the top. 1, 2 and 3 and 4. 1, 2 and 3 and 4. Okay, in time with the metronome. 2, 3 and 4, and 1, 2, kick, 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 snare. 1, 2, kick, 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 snare. Kick, snare, kick, 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 snare. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, and the last one on the page, just to add a little level of complexity, we have the kick drum on 1, we have a snare drum on 2, kick drum on the and then there's nothing on 3. Now, this can throw people when you first read it because you're always expecting something to be happening on 1 and 3. That's kind of where the beat is driving from, right? But nope, not on this occasion. Now, notice we don't put a rest there because we do actually have a note playing. It's a hi-hat. Okay, so as we're reading along, even though there's nothing on the bass drum, there doesn't need to be. We do have a note on the count of 3. It's just that it's a hi-hat sitting on its own. Okay, so bass drum, snare on 2, bass drum on 2 and, another bass drum on 3 and, snare on 4, and a bass drum on 4 and. So if I dial this one back just a touch, back to 65, this is where the kick drums are going to be. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now add the snare drum in. 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Okay, so putting that all together, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. All right. So again, there should be a whole bunch of books that you could pick up now. And even at this early stage, a lot of the songs that you play, a lot of the songs that you hear on the radio and that sort of thing, they're all based around predominantly quarter notes and eighth notes. So, muster a bit of courage and open a book, a songbook or whatever for drums, whatever you may have. Go online, have a look for some of this stuff, and things will start making sense. You'll start seeing beats that you recognize a heck of a lot more than you probably would have known last week. In fact, most of the time when we're playing anything based around rock, it's going to be eighth notes on the hi-hat. Not always, but most of the time it's going to be eighth notes on the hi-hat. All right. So in the chat comment, just let me know if you know who this literal Muppet is on the drums. It's a bit of a legend. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out because it's hilarious. But that's the lesson for eighth notes today. Again, the only thing that could really confuse you now is perhaps the order or the way in which the eighth notes are configured within measures, but that's really just familiarity now. You know what eighth notes look like. You know what eighth note rests look like. You know how they can be positioned on the bar. You know how they work with quarter notes. You know all about counting. You know about rests. You know about tempo. So, let's take stock of what we know. It's been 2 weeks now, and we've learned a heck of a lot about playing music, about reading music, counting music, and it's powerful stuff. And it really, from this point, just takes a little bit of practice. I'm going to just have a quick drink of my wine. If anybody has any questions they wish to ask, I'll just watch the chat and feel free to ask away. Okay, in fact, what I might do, just to prove the exercise, is I'm just going to open a screen, and let's just, I don't know, let's have a look at AC/DC drum music. Go back to my PowerPoint. Now, we've got a whole bunch of things that appear here, but have a look at this, all right? Now, it's actually written in a slightly different form to what we've seen it, and we'll get onto that next week, but what we're dealing with here is predominantly quarter notes and eighth notes. So you can see where it's got this word relaxed here. We can see that this is actually counted bass drum on 1, snare drum on 2, bass drum on 3, snare drum on 4, with hi-hats all across the top counted as eighth notes. Now, that looks a bit different to what we've learned, but in actual fact, it's exactly the thing that we've just seen, because if I was to open this up again, where are we here? Okay. It's actually that. All right, it's got the bass drum on 1 and 1 and 3, and it's got the snare drum on 2 and 4, exactly as we know it. But it's just written in a slightly different way. So what they've chosen to do with this drum music is to keep the kicks and the snares on their own as their own piece of music. Again, we'll look at that a little bit more next week. But there you go. So this is very real life stuff that you can play. Maybe mention 4 on the floor as a go-to. Yeah, Chris, that's actually a pretty good point. So maybe you've heard the concept of a 4 on the floor. And what that actually is when you're playing the 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes what you can do is to play all of those on the bass drum. So it's kind of like we're seeing with the Highway to Hell example that I just pointed out, except instead of just having the bass drum on the 1 and the 3, you'd actually also play it on the 2 and the 4. It's kind of actually what our hi-hat does or should be doing when we're over on the ride. It's like a timekeeper. So you can keep that bass drum going all the way through if you like. But of course, learning to break up those parts of the body is also important. So when you're opening a piece of music, it does obviously help to be able to play it the way that it's written. Let's have a look at some Metallica drum music and see if it's any different. Okay, so once again, it's written in a slightly different manner. There's a few notes there that we haven't seen, but for the most part, a lot of this is starting to look a little bit familiar. Okay, what do we got here? Sad but true. Here we go. So we've got quarter notes here. We've got some eighth notes. Remember the legend that I was talking about last week? We can see up in the top corner here that we have a little box that tells us where each instrument is going to be played relative to the staff. And the reason they do that is because as I said before in last week's example, we don't really have a standard. Some people write things in different ways and in different places. So it's always a good idea to be able to write out in the very beginning where everything is going to be. Okay? All right, so if there's no more questions, I'll leave it there. It's quite a long lesson, quite a lot to absorb and take in. But I do encourage you, do exactly what I've done. Go online, look at pieces of drum music, look at the songs that you always wanted to learn, but maybe you can't find a drum transcription, or not a transcription rather, but somebody playing it on YouTube, for example. If it's an obscure song that you want to learn, but no one seems to be covering it, well, now you actually have some options. See if you can find the sheet music or find something that sort of replicates what the sheet music is showing you. And lo and behold, you'll find that you're going to be able to start figuring some things out. Okay, so again, powerful stuff, and it only gets more powerful. Next week, we're going to look at another type of note, and then once we reach that third note, things are going to go kind of batshit crazy. So make sure that you understand quarter notes. Make sure that you understand the lesson tonight for eighth notes. We're going to look at our third type of note next week. We're going to mix them all together. And provided I can't throw you off with any of that stuff, then we're pretty much ready to take a really big jump into the depths of reading music. And you're not far from being able to read and write just about anything that you can imagine. Okay, so best of luck. And again, contact me offline if you guys need anything. And thanks once again.